turbo engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
questions,
Research.
technology.
Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to The Naked Scientists podcast, the show where we bring you the biggest breakthroughs in science, technology and medicine with me, Chris Smith. And this week, a breath of fresh air. Or is it? We're looking at the problem of air pollution.
From Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, this is The Naked Scientists.
Take a deep breath. Yes, literally. And ask yourself, what is in the air I just inhaled? It's almost certain, with our modern lives and built busy environments, that it contains a range of harmful particles alongside the oxygen we want. Now, whether it stems from city traffic or wildfires, air pollution has many sources. It affects all of us, and it has the potential to become much worse. So today, we're examining what constitutes a bad air day, the biggest producers of pollution, how we can monitor the problem, and what we can do to improve matters. But to begin with, what actually is air pollution? Well, Alistair Lewis is Professor of Atmospheric Chemistry at the University of York and the National Centre for Atmospheric Science.
Historically, sulfur dioxide has been a really major pollutant, for example, from burning coal. Nitrogen oxides, which come from high temperature combustion, individual organic compounds like benzene and formaldehyde. So they all refer to single individual chemical entities. And then we have another bunch of pollutants that are definitions, but actually chemically they're rather complex. So particulate matter is a good example. Anything that's floating around in air that isn't a gas, little solid particles, little liquid particles. Because they're so complicated chemically, we tend to define them by their size. So in air pollution, people refer to things like PM10 and PM2.5 and PM1. And that means all particles floating around in air that are smaller than 10 microns in diameter, or 2.5 microns, or 1 micron.
And do those sizes actually have health relevance? So is it a useful classification to break them down into those different sizes? Or is that just because it's a legacy of us detecting them and then labelling them?
It's a little bit of both, but actually the motivation for categorising by size is that the smaller the particle, the more likely it is to penetrate deep into your lungs. So if you go to a really busy, smoggy city, we're all kind of used to the example that if you blow your nose afterwards on a white handkerchief, all sorts of black dust and goo comes out. That's actually your nose doing a very effective job at filtering out big particles, perhaps 50 microns or 100 microns just at the entrance to your nose. When things get smaller than about 10 microns, they can pass through the first line of defense of your lungs and kind of get to the top of your throat. And if you get to about 2.5 microns, you can overcome the defenses there and get right down into your lungs. And perhaps smaller than a micron, you can penetrate right into the fine recesses of the lungs as well.
Have we always been exposed to this range of chemicals and this range of sizes of particles? Because it strikes me that technology, particularly urban environments, are going to be subject to big changes in technology over time. Coal fires and chimneys get invented by the Tudors and then cars come along in the more modern era, and now electric cars and the wear particles, brake particles, exhaust particles, they're all evolving and changing over time. So presumably this spectrum has changed.
It has, and this is one of the things that perhaps differentiates air pollution science, say, from climate science. So the climate has been driven by the same small group of gases for millennia. Air pollution changes with the technology of the day. And actually, the sort of idea of air pollution and health goes right back to Hippocrates and miasma theory at about 400 BC, this idea that bad air brought disease. I mean, over time, it's been the burning of fuels in particular has been a common theme that's run for thousands of years, and also some industrial processes as well that we've had that date back thousands of years that we know throw off smoke and particles. But when you get really into the detail, it does change by the year. So The Clean Air Act in England, which was brought in 1956, was a specific response to the really heavy sulfur smogs that we had in the 1950s derived from burning coal. Well, that's a problem now essentially completely dealt with. Our emissions of sulfur from coal have now gone to almost zero because we've closed our coal-fired power stations. But we've replaced them with other pollutants. So for example, we saw a really big growth in diesel road vehicles, and diesel road vehicles are very good at making nitrogen oxides. So the policies that you might have had for 10 years ago or 20 years ago probably aren't going to be effective for the next 10 or the next 20 years.
And are there any, I want to call them emerging pollutants, things that as we change our lifestyles, as we change our modus operandi, we do create these novel things? We're reining in fossil fuel driven cars and vehicles. We're replacing them with electric. Are we creating new threats as we do so?
We possibly are. I mean, the big picture is that in most high income countries, air quality is much, much better than it was 20 years ago, much better than it was 100 years ago. So we are on an improving trajectory. But as we've got rid of some of the most egregious sources of pollution, coal fires in the home and so on, we are left dealing with quite a complicated set of sources that are more and more tied to our own individual lifestyles. And actually, sometimes it's not so much that we've changed the source as we've changed the way that we live. So, for example, in our homes, if you open the cupboard under the stairs or the cupboard under the kitchen sink, you might find a very large number of chemical-containing products, sprays, half-used paint pans, varnishes, glues, all this sort of stuff. And they've had solvents in them for decades and decades. The change, of course, that's occurred perhaps over the last 10 to 20 years is we've made our homes airtight. So those emissions that used to blow out underneath drafty doors and windows, we now seal into our homes. So sometimes it's about the source changing. Sometimes we've changed how we're exposed. So we sort of seal ourselves inside our homes and offices and schools and so on for energy efficiency, which exposes us perhaps to the same chemicals but at higher concentrations because of ventilation.
Is another potential aggravating factor for all of the things you've discussed so far that's potentially hovering on the horizon climate change? Because that, to my mind, has the ability to mix everything up.
It does. Climate itself can impact on air quality through how it changes the weather. So, for example, warmer, hotter weather in summer can lead to increases in photochemical smog. Warmer weather can drive ammonia out of the ground or out of particles and into the gas phase. So there are physical interactions between climate and air quality. Not all of them are necessarily negative. So if we get regions of the world that have windier and wetter weather, that actually tends to improve air quality. So there are physical factors from climate that could work in both directions. The other intersection with climate, because is that we're doing lots of things around climate and climate change that potentially have some implication on air quality. And that's often a link that's notionally made in terms of trying to do things that bring co-benefits. So if you're going to introduce a very, very expensive change to society to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it would be really good if we could also deliver some air quality improvements with that same investment. You can really tip the business case in favour of the intervention by factoring in the health benefits you might get from that.
Alistair Lewis at the University of York and the National Centre for Atmospheric Science. But does this exposure to air pollution affect us? And what is the evidence for harm? Well, there are signals that asthma, heart disease, stroke, cognitive decline, and even behavioural problems in young children are all linked to poor air. So how big are the numbers? Well, Gary Fuller looks at the epidemiology of air pollution at Imperial College in London.
You've probably heard something about the 1952 smog and may even have seen it on an episode of The Crown. That taught us that really bad periods of air pollution killed people. A week-long smog in London in 1952 is thought to have killed around 12,000 people. Since then, we've learnt that the air pollution we experience on a daily basis actually causes more harm than these short-term spikes. One of the first studies in this area was done in the US and started in the 1970s, and they followed the lives of people living in 6 cities for around 14 to 16 years. And what they found looking across these cities was that people were dying at different rates in these cities. And some of it was explainable by things that we know about, like smoking, diet, weight, and things like this. But there was a large section that they couldn't explain. And that part we couldn't explain was associated with particle pollution in the air.
And what is the disease burden then across the world that we attribute to people breathing bad air day in, day out?
Yeah, globally, we estimate that over 4 million people are dying early because of the air pollution that they breathe. That's outdoor air pollution. Many people are cooking, for instance, in very confined spaces over open fires, and that's thought to add around 2 to 3 million to that score. It's estimated in London that around 4,000 people are dying early from air pollution that they breathe. For the UK, it's probably as many as 40,000. Europe, around 400,000. So these aren't small numbers, and it's not just confined to developing countries. It's a global problem.
How do scientists think, though, that air pollution actually leads to this loss of life? Because when we say something causes something, if it's going to fulfill the criteria for causality, it's got to be biologically plausible. There's got to be a mechanism we can point at to say this is how this is happening. So what do we think at a high level is going on when people are exposed chronically to bad air, and why that translates into people dying?
One set of theories is that particle pollution and other gaseous pollution that you have just simply overcomes the natural defences that are present in our lung linings. And this in turn causes inflammation, which then affects the whole circulatory and respiratory system. Other theories put forward suggest that smaller particles can actually transfer across the lung lining and enter our body, where they can then affect biological mechanisms. I think one of the most interesting things that's emerging in the last probably 10 years is new knowledge that air pollution is also affecting our brain health. And here one of the exposure routes may not be through the lungs and circulatory system, but may actually be through the olfactory bulb that sits there sort of at the back of your nose and is more or less connected to your brain. And it's suggested that some particle pollution may be able to enter the brain directly from that point.
We've even had reports, because I remember talking to the team down in London who got placentas collected from women who'd just recently given birth, living in London. They reported finding particulates, presumably breathed in by those women while they were pregnant, in those placentas. So this, it kind of suggests that you begin to be affected by pollution before you've even been born in some cases.
That's right. The early studies, and those that most of our sort of legislation and regulation is based on, is the science of the 20th century. Through the 21st century, we've been learning that air pollution affects us through all stages of our life, not just at the end of our life when we talk about, someone's death being brought forward. So there's evidence that air pollution is affecting pregnancy. So we have outcomes such as miscarriage or babies being born with low birth weight for their gestational age. Through childhood, we of course know a lot about things that you may read about in the newspaper to do with new cases of asthma, for instance. And we see the same through adulthood. We're also seeing other disease endpoints such as cancer and stroke. But I think most troubling really that's coming out new, as I say, is this new evidence on brain health. So we're seeing within children that are exposed to air pollution, we're seeing behavioural things in the classroom to do with attention deficits and those sorts of learning things. And then later on in life, we're seeing firmer evidence of air pollution and depression and dementia as well.
A lot of the commentary around air pollution tends to be quite negative, but I suppose one of the good things about studying this, if we find these associations and causal relationships, is that then we have a way of intervening, because we can say, well, if we know that is doing that, we can then do something about it, and we know what to measure to see if the intervention is actually working.
And there's quite a few studies that have been done that have shown exactly this. Perhaps one of the most famous ones was done in Ireland around 1990. And at that time, a lot of Irish homes in Dublin were burning coal for heat. The government banned the most smoky types of coal just from Sal, and that produced an instant improvement. So in the following winter, the number of people that were dying from respiratory problems in Dublin reduced by 16%. And if you could think about that as, 1 in 8, it's a big impact on the city. But if we want to look to the future, one of the biggest things we're going to do this century is action on climate. Dr. Maria Neira from World Health Organization was speaking in London just a couple of weeks ago, and she frames the action we're going to take on climate as possibly the biggest public health intervention of the century. For instance, in the US, it's estimated that by 2035, if they choose to follow actions on climate, they could reduce the number of people dying from air pollution by somewhere between 4,000 and 15,000 per year, and importantly, saving the US economy between about 65 and 128 billion.
Big numbers, aren't they? That was Gary Fuller from Imperial College. This is the Naked Scientist podcast with me, Chris Smith, and we're talking about bad air as our topic for this week. We're asking what's the scale of the threat and how can we clear up the air we breathe. So far, we've talked about what air pollution is, where it comes from, and the evidence for and scale of its impact on our health. But how can we actually track and measure the quality of the air we're breathing? Historically, this was quite hard and expensive to do, so it was mostly the preserve of governments and health watchdogs. But with new technology, it is becoming much easier to keep tabs on air pollution. And in countries where this is a problem, people are now taking matters into their own hands to monitor the air and take steps to protect themselves and their families. One initiative to help people to do this is called Air Gradient. It's a business set up in Thailand, but now acting internationally by financier Achim Haug, who's the CEO. Their lightweight, low-cost monitors are for domestic and outdoor air monitoring. The data are made available to the user both on the device but also remotely via a web page. This has got huge potential to build a massive global air quality data set and empower the common man, woman and child at home. And it's all being done in an open source way. And what got it started in the first place is an interesting story in its own right.
I'm originally from Germany, but I have been based in Thailand for quite a long time. I went on a sabbatical and I was volunteering at my kids' school, and that was in northern Thailand. And they have a 5th season called burning season. And in 2019, it had really, really hard. And I could see how the whole community is struggling with the air pollution. And
when you say burning season, you literally mean burning.
Exactly. So we are surrounded by wildfires. There's stubble burning with rice fields. The air quality is 100 times above the World Health Organization recommended levels. So it's an inferno, I would say.
And that inspired you to think, well, what can we do about this? How do we improve the lot of people who are living there, breathing that in every day?
Exactly. So we saw the anxiety in the community. We saw also like that the head of school didn't know, are the classrooms safe or not? So together with my co-founder, we just built air quality monitors as a DIY project, basically, put them into classrooms, made a simple dashboard so that the head of school can just see on his desk which classrooms are safe, which are not.
And the sensors that you have managed to create, tell us about them. What are they? What do they do? How do they work?
Yeah, so we measure a couple of different parameters. So, for example, particulate matter, PM2.5, CO2, VOCs, volatile organic compounds, also NOx, and temperature, humidity. And basically, these are all different sensor modules that we combine with a microcontroller, and that sends the data then through Wi-Fi or cellular to a dashboard, basically.
I have to say, you sent me a couple to try. One that works indoors and one that's built for working outside. And I think I have never, in all the years I've been playing with techie things, and I'm a bit geeky like you as well, I've never had a device that was so easy to set up, and within minutes it was working the way I wanted it to work, and it's worked flawlessly ever since, as in it got online, it's accessible, I can see the data, and it hasn't crashed my computer once. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one advantage was actually when after we started a year later, COVID hit and everything shut down. So we had a lot of time to really fine tune this. And actually, the monitor you have is the 9th generation. And we only went basically out to sell it, I think, after generation 6. So even it looks simple, there's actually a lot of things that went into it.
The thing is, the company you've set up is doing things slightly unusually because you actually don't take steps to make things hard to copy and to protect. You actually give everything away. What's the business model then?
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, somebody once said AirGradient has a counterintuitive business model, and I think that really hits it. So all our monitors, everything you can see on our website is open source hardware. And that means that you can take the design, build this whole thing, basically clone it completely, sell it, and you don't have to give us anything. So a lot of people then ask me, hey, how do you actually make money? Because we are based in Thailand. We are a for-profit company. We don't get any funding, any grants, anything. We make money by selling the same product that we offer as an open source design.
So effectively, you're your own competitor. So how do you make any money?
Well, yeah, we make money by selling our own products. And I think it makes us a lot stronger because by being so open and we compete with ourselves basically. So we always have to make sure we innovate. But on the other hand, we also get a lot of contributions. So other people can actually read the source code. And we had people from the community helping us finding bugs in the source code and to make the product better. So it's really like you give something away and you get something in return.
I'm not just saying this because you're sitting here. I am very impressed with the technology and also quite terrified in equal measure because I put one in my kitchen, I put one in an outbuilding. The one in the outbuilding is so sensitive it can see the CO2 plume when my wife starts her car in the morning. I've got an electric car so it doesn't see mine. The one in the kitchen, when the kids put the bacon on, oh my goodness, the number of particulates and the CO2 level, it climbs through the roof, but the number of particulates, scary. We're all breathing that in.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think that's a lot of people realize once they really measure especially indoor air quality. But then this really opens this opportunity to improve it. You could actually just make something with your kid and say, okay, do we do fried eggs or boiled eggs or scrambled eggs and just see the difference in pollution, and you will see a big difference.
Well, your gadget has an array of lights on it, as well as a screen, which you can read the figures off the screen, but the array of lights, they kind of, as soon as I put the frying pan on, it goes all purple. It's kind of saying, get out now, evacuate time level, isn't it? But is this translating into a big help? You set out to help people in Thailand during burning season to improve air quality and remove exposure or reduce exposure for kids. Is it doing what you hoped it would when you set the project up?
Yes, I think the data is the first step, and the data then creates awareness. I mean, the things that you realized in your kitchen. And then I think it's also important to distinguish, like if you have a short-term spike, it's not as critical as being permanently or over weeks or exposed to very polluted air. So this awareness really helps then to go into action, basically. So you can open the windows in the kitchen. People in Thailand, if it's a more permanent thing, they can get an air purifier, for example, to clean the air more permanently.
That is a great story, isn't it? And those monitors really are superb. I'm not just saying it. Akeem showed me the next generation he's got coming out soon, and they're going to be solar powered, which will make monitoring, even in remote places, that bit easier. That was Akeem Haug at AirGradient. You can look them up online. Finally, having established the scale of the air pollution problem and the potential health impacts, we're going to examine what policymakers can do to improve the quality of the air we breathe. Beth Gardner's an American journalist. She's based in London, and she is the author of Choked: Life and Breath in the Age of Air Pollution.
This is not actually an impossible problem, right? It is fixable. It's not climate change that requires a wholesale sort of shift to new kinds of energy. The US has improved its air quality much, much more quickly than Europe has. And that really comes down to a very strong law passed in 1970, effective regulation and good enforcement. That doesn't sound really sexy and exciting when you talk about regulation and enforcement, But the thing with air pollution is that there's not one cause, so there's not one solution, right? You have to address the cars, you have to address the smokestacks, you have to look at all the different factors. What that law did in the US and what's happening today actually in China, which we're sort of used to thinking of as a poster child for bad air quality, they are actually making enormous strides. And it's sort of through some of the same things the United States did in decades past. Cars sold in the US are now 99% cleaner, not in terms of greenhouse gases and climate, but in terms of the stuff that we are breathing in that comes out of the tailpipe.
Why, though, flipping it over, is Europe still in a bad way then? You're saying that the US has performed well, China is cleaning up its act, Europe has been lagging behind. What's missing in Europe then?
This is really comes down to an enforcement failure. If you remember in the headlines almost 10 years ago now, in 2015, the Dieselgate scandal, when we learned that all these car companies were actually led by VW, but many others as well, selling cars whose tailpipe emissions, the pollution they were putting out, was many times over the limit by, 6, 8, 10 times over. Europe has never really built an effective mechanism for actually making the car companies follow the law. And what we've seen even today, because of those enforcement failures across the continent and in the UK, are that those cars are still out there. Those Dieselgate cheating cars, they are not meeting the legal limit as it exists today of what they're allowed to pollute. And it's why what we've seen across Europe and the UK is this kind of patchwork approach where every city, every local council is left on their own. In London, the mayor, Sadiq Khan, has passed some really effective laws that have improved air quality. And that's great, but it would be so much more effective to be done at the national or Europe-wide level. No mayor, no local council can force a giant multinational corporation like VW or another car manufacturer to get their cars into compliance. Only national governments and the EU can do that.
How does it vary geographically, though? Because you began this conversation with me talking about America and Europe, Western societies. Presumably around the world, there are going to be different threats hitting different people to different extents. So are we in a situation where one size fits all is not going to work and we do need a kind of bespoke plan for different geographies? Or are there some generic things we all should be doing and we've got to get everyone to sign up to them?
There are a sort of set of policies and approaches that have been shown to work in fixing air pollution. How any individual country approaches it is going to be down to them. And the mix of what the pollution sources are is obviously going to determine that. But wherever you look, really, this is something that needs to be addressed at a governmental level. And what tends to work is the government doing a careful scientific analysis of what their pollution sources are, and then tackling them sort of one by one, whether that's the farmers burning crops in their fields. That's such a big problem across India, South Asia, whether it's heavy industry, for example, in China. And in a lot of ways, sort of what it comes down to is difficulties around the effectiveness of government. China has proved itself able, being a significantly wealthier country now than it was even 10, 15 years ago, to clean the air. And in India and Pakistan, the governments have not been able to flex out muscle to sort of require the old coal power plants to clean up, to give the farmers different ways of clearing their land rather than burning the crop stubble every year in this way that creates huge clouds of smoke that drift towards the big cities. So a lot of it comes down to the ability of the government to be effective. And of course, that does tend to correlate with wealth and development and good infrastructure in countries.
Beth Gardner, author of Choked, Life and Breath in the Age of Air Pollution. So really, it's not rocket science, is it? That's the message emerging from this week's programme. We've got clear evidence of health harm stemming from airborne pollution, and with rising population, urbanisation and industrialisation, this is intensifying, although some countries have indeed scored laudable wins. Nevertheless, the World Health Organization regard bad air as one of the current biggest global health threats. And because the impacts accrue over long periods of time, it's one of those threats that we can sleepwalk into, often oblivious to low-level, persistent exposure. I'd urge you, if you're motivated by this week's programme to learn more, to grab one of Akeem's monitors, or if you're feeling particularly adventurous, grab his source code and build your own one for fun. Putting it into my kitchen has certainly opened my eyes, and it's led to some very interesting dinner table conversations, actually, about air quality. That said, it hasn't stopped me frying the bacon, though, because some things are sacrosanct. Next week, measles is the topic du jour. Around the world, cases are surging, even in geographies where measles hasn't circulated for decades. So why is that, and what can we do about it? The Naked Scientist comes to you from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education, and it's supported by Rolls-Royce. A big shout out and a thank you to those of you who support us with donations to the programme, some of you every month, some of you on a one-off basis, all of you extremely generous. We are very, very grateful. And if you do appreciate this programme and what we do for you each week and you'd like to show your support, we would love that. Please go to nakedscientist.com/donate. nakedscientist.com/donate. It's very easy to do. I'm Chris Smith. From all of us here at the Naked Scientist team, thank you very much for listening. And until next time, goodbye.